possible by the Embassy of Japan through the National Association of Japan America Societies. And this series brings topics of current interest about Japan, about U.S. Japan relations to communities all across the United States. So we thank them for their sponsorship of this program. So I would like to turn it over to Betty, and she will get us started.
Thank you, Amy, so much for your partnership. Hi everyone, my name is Betty Cruz. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. This is a long-standing partnership. Once a year we come together with the Japan American Society, so it's really great to be here with you today and with our esteemed speakers. At the Council, we seek to convene and connect people around global issues to build a thriving, competitive, and inclusive Pittsburgh. And we're guided by our vision of a globally minded and globally connected world that is equitable and just for all. Can't do that alone. It takes all of us who are in this room and many, many others. So again, we're grateful for being here tonight. We'd like to acknowledge that today's program is taking place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is the unceded ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Seneca, the Nazi, and the Shawnee. We're mindful that our work here is possible because the lands and lives of people native to this place were stolen. Generation upon generation, past, present, and future, of indigenous people here and all over the world are respectful stewards of the earth and its resources. So through this acknowledgement, I invite you to join me in paying respect to our elders, both past and present. Thank you. Now, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Phillip Peduto, a distinguished executive in residence at Carnegie Mellon University. Bill served as the 60th mayor of the city of Pittsburgh from 2014 through 2022. Prior to taking office, he worked for 19 years on Pittsburgh City Council, 7 years as a staffer, and then 12 years as a member of council. In January, Bill, the grandson of steelworkers, authored a piece for Washington Monthly entitled "Steel Can Lead the Green Revolution." Mayor, my old boss, please take it away.
Thank you, Betty. I'm very honored to be invited by Betty Cruz. She was one of the first people I hired for our new administration. She was challenged with a new office that looked at marginal communities, our homeless community, veterans, new immigrants, and she was the author of Welcoming Pittsburgh. We put Pittsburgh on the map as one of the first welcoming cities before sanctuary cities were even a word. So Betty, thank you for the work you did for Pittsburgh and for this invitation. The article that she mentioned was from a visit that I had in November with a group from the Midwest. I was the lone Appalachian, and we visited in Belgium, France, and Germany the areas that will be left behind. The coal regions, the heavy manufacturing, and the steel regions. And we visited with the steel workers in Saarland in Germany on the French border. And they were insistent that the government listened to them. And they had a protest in the streets with 10,000 workers. And we asked, what is it that you want? And they said, we want green hydrogen. We want 3 facilities built to be able to produce green steel. Because BMW, Audi, and Mercedes-Benz said if we don't produce green steel by 2035, they'll buy their steel somewhere else. Before we left, the German government had committed $1 billion to building that first facility. We have an opportunity now in this country to look at examples such as this and to learn from different parts of the world. And today we'll be learning from Japan, a country that has made this transition, or at least has gone further than what we have done, and to be able to understand where we can be. So let me introduce very quickly and ask them to give a more detailed introduction, our 3 panelists. And if you don't mind spending 3 to 5 minutes to tell a little bit about the work you do and how it has this impact that could help regions like Western Pennsylvania that otherwise would be left behind in the Great Transition. and then finally, Dr. Phillip Lipscy. Ken?
Thank you for your kind introduction. Very good evening to you all. My name is Koyama from Japan. I'm working for the Institute of Energy Economics Japan. We call it IEEJ as a senior managing director and chief economist. I majorly work for the energy security and geopolitics of energy. And through this lens, I'm also working for the decarbonization or carbon neutrality or climate change issues, which is a very important topic for energy. Today, I'd like to have 2-3 minutes to share what is the most important challenge for all of us in the United States, in Japan, in the world. Firstly, we are now in the great energy transition to achieve energy security and climate change protection in a simultaneous manner. It is really important because energy is an essential commodity for everyone. And second, that we need to understand that we are living in a very difficult world under the increasing serious divided world. U.S. China conflict, Western and the China-Russian conflict, and emergence of global South countries. And the thirdly important issue is energy transition to address climate change and energy security. It's becoming increasingly difficult. One of the reasons of the difficulty comes from our society became very sensitive or vulnerable to energy cost or energy price hike. This is the case for United States, this is the case for Japan, this is the case for Europe. Even the advanced economy or developed countries experience the vulnerability to the energy price hike. So which means probably we need to minimize the cost to energy transition. Otherwise, it will create a big problem. And the fourth issue is we need innovation. Without innovation, like CO2-free hydrogen, direct air capture, negative emission technology, or new technology for renewable nuclear power, without this technology, we cannot reach carbon neutrality or advance energy security. And that's why United States, Japan, Europe, and major countries all pushing very hard for industrial policy. In case of the United States, it is very famous, globally famous IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, is attracting global attention. In case of Japan, we have the initiative for green transformation, we call it GX. So under the circumstance, my major point is US and Japan need to collaborate, even in this industrial policy, to address the climate change and energy security. And this is mutually important for both the United States and Japan, but also globally, to address the energy challenge in developing country and global South country. U.S. Japan collaboration is a key policy. In particular, if we try to decouple the economic growth and deep GHG reductions, U.S.-Japan collaboration, and hopefully U.S. Japan and this area and Japan collaboration can play a key. That's a first one.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the quick introductions. I'm Shimizu. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and I primarily study policy making and policy implementation. So I very much share Ken's opinions and concerns about the climate change policies. But I want to then add to his comments by saying that I'm particularly interested and have been studying 2 issues in particular. First is agriculture, which is responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse emissions worldwide. And this is an area in which Japan's policymaking is particularly complex and difficult because of several issues, including Japan's aging population, especially among farmers, This is an issue that requires rapid innovation and technological change in order for both sustainability and climate change policies, but also just food security issues for Japan to be able to be sustained for long term. And these are issues that pertain to farmers here in the United States as well. Farming populations worldwide are aging quite rapidly. And the other issue area that I study is global supply chains, and in particular as it relates to the transition away from fuel combustion engines, that is automobiles that use fossil fuels, including petroleum and diesel fuel. And primarily this would be in the area of electric vehicles, which we see as becoming more and more popular, but also resistance to this change to an EV automobile infrastructure, especially as we see countries like China really pushing for low-cost EV production at scales that are unprecedented. In a way that has been, in the eyes at least of the United States and probably of Japan, quite aggressive as far as industrial policy is concerned. And so one of the policy areas that I'm very much interested in is a term coined by the Economist journal called Alt-Asia, which means alternative to Asia, for maintaining a supply chain. And we know that here, especially in the United States, there's been a lot of policy calls for the Biden administration to try to stop, or at least bring back to the United States the production of key components for electric vehicles, in particular the semiconductor chips that operate an electric vehicle, and also for batteries that help, of course, propel the engine forward. And so this change in the supply chain of electric vehicles that would, in the long run, help to mitigate carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning cars is a very complex, fraught, and contested issue area, especially here in the Midwest or Western Pennsylvania. We've recently observed protests by UAW, and auto workers unions, and others who are not quite sure how this transition would benefit workers who have long worked in the traditional automobile sectors of the United States. And this is a concern that's also shared by Japanese automakers as well. So in the realm of both agriculture and automobile sector, these are two industries where I feel that U.S. Japan collaboration could be especially productive in the field, of course, of technology and innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology and innovation sometimes can turn on a dime. We know, for example, in the United States, there was a recent report of a sudden discovery of rare earth minerals in Wyoming in volumes never seen before, multiple times that which is found in China. That could be a potential very big game changer for not just the United States, but U.S. trade partners like Japan. So I don't want to go too far into details, but those are the two areas, application areas, that I'm particularly interested in my own work.
No.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for the kind introduction, and to the organizers for putting together such a wonderful event, and to all the audience members. I look forward to your questions later on. My name is Phillip Lipscy. I'm a professor of political science currently at the University of Toronto, where I also direct what's called the Center for the Study of Global Japan, a research center related to contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy. Currently, I'm a professor at University of Tokyo in the Faculty of Law, where I teach in the summertime. I research a variety of topics, but in terms of the subject matter of interest today, I'll speak about a few. So one question that animates quite a bit of my work is the variation that we observe in the world in terms of how countries tackle energy policy and climate change policy. So for many years, social scientists saw climate change as an international cooperation problem. That basically we need to put in place a framework for countries to cooperate, to agree that we're going to reduce emissions, and that is the best way to solve the issue. Of course, those efforts have not yielded significant progress and have contributed to much frustration over the years. But at the same time, if you look cross-nationally, across countries, you see a lot of variation in the kinds of policy tools countries are using, the magnitude of effort countries are putting in to try to reduce their emissions and transform their energy sectors to decarbonize. And so one of the big questions that I look at in my research is what is that variation? Why is it that some countries are able to increase prices on the consumption of carbon, for example? Why is it that some countries can shift very rapidly to nuclear or renewables, whereas other countries tend to be much slower or try and then fail as there's backlash in society? So I've looked quite a bit at that general question. And in regards to Japan, I've also looked over the years quite a bit at Japanese domestic energy and climate change policy. And here I think a very interesting thing is Japan used to be known as a leader. After the oil shock of 1973, many observers suggested that Japan had done essentially a good job. They increased nuclear share of power generation, they focused on energy efficiency and conservation, and compared to other countries, Japan seemed to be managing the shock quite effectively. But on the other hand, if you look at media reports about Japan's climate change policy today, you'll see headlines like Japan wins fossil award for being very slow in decarbonizing, or Japan exits from the Kyoto Protocol, which is, after all, named after a city in Japan. And so it's an interesting contrast of the kinds of conditions that lead to success in one time period, but difficulties in another. And in my research, I argue that this has to do with political changes that have happened in Japan since the 1990s, particularly changes to the electoral system and changes to the way the government administration is run. I won't go into the great detail, but I think there's a lot of interesting lessons that we can learn from Japan as we think about climate change policy in the United States as well. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Can just go a little bit deeper as you talked about innovation, key technologies. What do you see in your personal beliefs as the greatest threats and the greatest opportunities as we're making this transition?
Thank you for your question. I think that now for energy transition, we are seeing a kind of competition who is a leader of innovative technology, or in other words, the technological hegemony is global concern. For example, during the past 4 decades, key principle for the global market is free trade and international digital labels, where the United States has no problem to import product and goods from, for example, China. European nation has no problem with importing energy from Russia. But the division of the world is becoming serious. People's perception and concern completely changed. We are now prioritizing the domestic supply, and even we cannot completely be successful self-sufficient of key technology or key strategic commodity, strategic goods. We will try to build up a supply chain among allies or like-minded countries or strategic partner like the United States. Japan. So under the circumstance, we have an opportunity to cooperate and to promote innovation so that we can be a winner for the technical project in the next 2 decades to achieve the energy transition. But again, strength or challenge is competition is so serious. And sometimes the global system became valuable by the strength of potential supply reduction or even some emergency. That's the case of the Ukraine war and the Russian aggression to Ukraine. So I think that it is important to pay great attention to what is happening now in the real world. And from the viewpoint of Japan, geopolitical constraint and geopolitical strength comes from various angles. Firstly, still we have a dependent on Middle East energy supply. Because of the Russian-Ukraine aggression, we decided to move away from Russian oil, which resulted in the higher dependence on Middle East oil. In 50 years ago, when the first oil crisis happened, Japan's dependence on the Middle East oil is about 80%, but now 94%. So the stability of the Middle East is really important, and it is that the United States continues to play a very pivotal role to contribute to the stability in the Middle East. What's going to happen in the Middle East has a very complicated relation with the situation in the United States. And also, Japan-China relation is also a serious constraint. As a neighboring country, we need to survive each other, but we have to be very cautious about the rising power of China. That's why I think that the existence of deeply divide into a global market, energy space, is the key threat and potential opportunity among like countries.
Just to follow up with that, and just to how Japan sees the polarization that's occurring in the world between democratic states and authoritarian regimes.
I hope that Japan, as a democratic state, we need to work together as a like country and allies, so that we can build up a more safe and sound global society. We do hope, but still, it's a needed challenge for everyone.
Kate, we have a question that was submitted in advance. I'm going to read this. They asked, how can we motivate local government in environmental justice, designated areas to address climate change, and ensure they are accessing and utilizing all monies available to support preventive and/or remediation actions in the community?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think this came from an audience member and was submitted earlier. Well, here we are in the city of Pittsburgh, one of the great examples of a transition away from sort of heavy industries to a more sustainable and environmentally minded city. So I think this is a very pertinent question. One of the things that is happening now, and Ken mentioned earlier, is in this more polarized world, where there is geopolitical competition between the United States or between democracies and non-democracies, the turn to industrial policy, which essentially means using large amounts of public or taxpayer money, approximately, to change the economic marketplace of both energy sources but also energy consumption, is coming to a head at a very rapid clip. The CHIPS Act, for example, is a very big one where billions of dollars are being allocated by Congress to try to change the long-standing supply chain, global supply chain, that was put in place during a time where free trade among both democratic and non-democratic countries were promoted, especially under the WTO, so the 1990s all the way through probably the 2010s or so. And then in the last few years, there's been a big backlash to that. So cities like Pittsburgh or really local governments everywhere need to be extremely mindful of the fact that billions of dollars, literally, of taxpayers' money are now being used for this purpose. And I think that as citizens, we should be very mindful of how this money is being spent. If they decided to spend it, is it being spent in a way where there is great concern for both workers and the health of citizens? And so both education, educating ourselves, educating our neighbors about the fact that this money is being spent, how it's being spent, and political participation, of course, and having our voices heard, especially in an election year like this one, is critical to making sure that we take advantage of the democratic nature of our politics and to make sure that our local government and also federal government leaders are using taxpayer money responsibly so that we are addressing issues of climate change and also the health and well-being of our local communities in a way that's fiscally responsible as well.
So with a series of acts that the Biden administration has put money on, trillions of dollars, do you see opportunities for Western Pennsylvania in looking at local government in order to be able to take advantage of these funds and to be able to start to make the transformation of our region into clean energy?
Well, surely in the area of both education and innovation, I think that there's a tremendous amount of funding available. Obviously, there are 3 academics here on the, Mayor are also considered an honorary academic at Carnegie Mellon. So we should be really utilizing these funds for both research and development, of which there is a tremendous amount, and also bring clean industries to the Pittsburgh area, Western Pennsylvania area, so that our citizens and workers could take advantage of it, and also that our students are preparing themselves for new industries that come into this area and being able to take advantage of education that they get in our universities and other institutions of learning. And so, in particular, many dollars, literally trillions of dollars, are now being distributed very rapidly by the federal and also local governments in the area of new innovation technologies. And so we should really be able to take huge advantage, especially with these 2 educational institutions.
I completely agree. I coined it a PIP, private institutional public partnership. And that critical component of the research and development that universities can provide can help to transform regions. I have, Phillip, another question. You co-authored a piece in The Diplomat last October titled, "Can Japan be a Climate Change Leader?" In it, you noted that, quote, Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world, is striving to achieve a carbon-neutral society by 2050, while reducing greenhouse gases as an international responsibility. With this in mind, the country's national energy strategy particularly emphasizes energy security, economic efficiency, and environmental protection as well as safety. Can you tell us more about your case for Japan as a potential leader in this space, and what lessons Japan can offer to the United States?
Sure, absolutely. So I think there are lots of admirable qualities of Japan's energy policy, climate change policy. Japan particularly stands out in terms of energy efficiency, essentially how much economic output is used per unit of energy consumed. And for example, on the regulatory front, Japan innovated what's called the Top Runner program. And this is basically energy efficiency standard, where you look at the market, and whichever product has the best energy efficiency performance becomes The following year, you look at the market again, and the best product becomes the standard again. And this is quite creative and ingenious because it's realistic. The product already exists, so regulators aren't setting an impossible standard that might not be met at all, but it's not too weak, right? Sometimes the standard is insufficient and everybody's meeting it, and it's meaningless. And so I think on the regulatory front, Japan offers important lessons. Another area where Japan stands out, if you look at international data, is in the transportation sector. And essentially, Japan is quite distinct from just about every other OECD country in the fact that people travel less. And when they travel, they're much more likely to use rail transportation. And that means you don't emit nearly as much CO2 compared to the United States, for sure, but even compared to small European countries that have geographic advantages similar to Japan. And this has a lot to do with urban planning. So zoning rules in Japan are less restrictive, so people can live closer to shops, to where they work. Commute times are shorter. Of course, the bullet train system in Japan is exceptionally well developed, while highway tolls are relatively expensive. So that creates an incentive. Not only the government creates a high-speed rail network, but it creates a financial incentive to actually use it, because driving the same distance is actually quite expensive in Japan. So I think the United States and other countries have plenty to learn from the way Japan has designed its transportation sector, and that's a place for inspiration. Japan also has a lot of cutting-edge technologies in areas like hydrogen, carbon recapture, geothermal energy, and these are all well worth studying for lessons. But I do want to emphasize, of course, that all is not great. Japan is a leader in many fields, but it's also the case that Japan has a lot of work to do in continuing to make progress on emissions reductions. The overall track record in Japan over the past 20 years has not been standout in international comparison. So Japan also has much to learn from the strengths of other countries. Thank you.
So one final question before we open it up to the audience. I would ask that between all three about 5 minutes total. It's the one big issue that, recognizing that the Blue-Green Alliance was created here in Pittsburgh in 2007 between the partnership of the United Steel Workers and the Sierra Club, and a goal of creating good jobs, green jobs. Given the growing attention and recent developments with Nippon U.S Steel announcement, from your vantage point, what is the impact of Nippon's acquisition of U.S Steel, and in particular, as one lifetime member of the Mon Valley said, they want to hear specifically what Nippon Steel is going to do to address the dangerously high levels of benzene being emitted from the U.S Steel Clairton coke works, and I would also ask what the benefit would be to the union workers. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for very important and timely point. And basically, the motivation or the driver for the deal between the Nippon Steel and U.S Steel is economic logic for their own survival. The very challenging business environment for both countries. So I think that the business logic need to continue to play out significantly. But at the same time, we all know that this year is a very special year for the United States. Election politics is a key implement and dominant element to be considered. But having said that, again, I think from both countries, companies' perspective, I think that this deal, I hope, can be very successful, so that it will contribute to several very important elements. One is potentially contribute to the environment. The question raised, frankly speaking, that I'm not a specialist on steel industry. I'm doing work on energy and climate. But from my experience in working with Japanese energy industries, Japanese industry are extremely keen to combat local environment, air and water, and other local environment issues. Based on our experience in 1960s, 70s, 80s, the industry in Japan worked very hard to improve the quality of environment locally. And I think from that perspective that the Nippon Steel will try to see the current situation that the question addressed and try to do what they can do best. So in that respect, I think that it may contribute to the local environment, I hope. And second point of the environment is of course climate change. In the medium and long term, I think steel industry or iron industry is regarded as the most difficult industry to decarbonize, so-called hard to abate sector. And to address these issues, clearly technological innovation and large-scale investment in new technology is required, like hydrogen reaction, steel, with this, I think that the combination of U.S. Japan companies can play a role to address this long-term strategy. Again, it will have a contribution to the improvement of two countries and global climate issues. And finally, the U.S. Japan collaboration will be an essential part of the story to counter the polarization.
I just want to add a quick note to Ken's excellent answer there. One of the things that Japanese companies, but Japan as a whole has done in the past is to use regulations that exist not in Japan, but in other countries to then pressure their own country or to pressure their own companies to rise to the occasion and to submit to higher standards, whether it be about the environment or sustainability or decarbonization. And I suspect that we don't know the details yet. In fact, USW has recently signed a non-disclosure agreement with Nippon Steel, so really none of us really know what the details are of the negotiation going on right now. But I suspect that one of Nippon Steel's strategies is just that, to use the perhaps somewhat higher standards of environmental protection and clean energy here in the United States, in particular locally here in Pittsburgh, to pressure its own company, parent company executives in Japan to meet higher standards of everything from decarbonization to clean energy and climate change that does not, or is more politically difficult to put forward in Japan. And so I suspect that this is part of the works. And one of the things that Nippon Steel will have to do is to figure out how that will happen on the ground if this deal does go through.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Those are both excellent answers, but I would re-emphasize that Japan is, of course, a U.S. ally, long-standing, and so even though this would be a foreign acquisition, it's fundamentally different from an acquisition involving a potential adversary. I would also agree that the fundamental rationale for this acquisition is not environmental, it's economic, but by publicizing some of these issues and challenges that might arise in terms of both labor and environmental concerns, it may actually lead to greater pressure for both companies to perform better. And so I think that public scrutiny that's occurring right now could serve a helpful purpose in that respect.
Thank you. We're going to go to the questions from the audience. Do you want this one? Okay.
Thank you so much for having me last second. So yes, please make sure you can make your questions as concise as possible, and just a friendly reminder, question ends with a question mark. And that way we can move through as many as possible in the next 15 minutes. I see one question over here.
So I had two questions. The first was, you mentioned a change in Japan's energy record between the 1970s and now. Was the Fukushima incident a catalyzing reason for that?
So the answer is yes. To say the Fukushima disaster led to the essentially total shutdown of nuclear power generation in Japan. It's come back partially, but when that happens, obviously the ability to decarbonize is going to be sharply affected. And the trend started earlier in the 1990s, and essentially, what I've written in my own academic work is that the political changes that happened in Japan starting in the 1990s have somewhat Americanized the Japanese political system. The electoral system now is more of an American-style single-member district system, and this type of electoral system makes politicians much more sensitive to the price concerns of the median voter. And of course, we talk about gasoline taxes as being the third rail of American politics. It's become a little bit more like that in Japan in recent years. Both major parties, the Liberal Democratic Party and the Democratic Party of Japan, have campaigned on we're going to lower the burden of high energy prices on consumers rather than increasing, for example, carbon taxes to promote climate change. And at the same time, you've had administrative reform that's put more power into the hands of politicians rather than bureaucrats. Bureaucrats in Japan were somewhat insulated from these types of interest group politics and consumer backlash. And so you essentially have in Japan today the same kinds of challenges that the U.S. political system has oftentimes faced in terms of it's very difficult to implement the types of policy measures you need to transition to a more energy efficient and decarbonized economy.
On that note, I did want to ask something drawing on what former Mayor Peduto had mentioned about left behind industrial communities in the U.S. and Europe. What is Japan doing to prevent communities from being left behind in its industrial settings?
That's an interesting question. What is Japan doing to combat left behind industrial sectors? I'm not sure that those areas are as numerous or prevalent in Japan as they once used to be. Japan does have a so-called West Belt that goes all along the Pacific coast, so-called throughout this Pacific side of Japan. But it's important to note that Japan is a much smaller size country, fits snugly into the state of California, and its industrial zones, there are not that many that have been so-called sort of left behind in the process. There are not that many zones to begin with, so that's one. But where it is potentially being left behind is in because of the demographic issue, and this we cannot overstate for Japan's future industrial, both from a technological perspective, but from a production perspective. Japan's population overall is already on the decline. Our fertility rate is well below replacement at 1.3, one of the lowest in the world. And so that means that the number of workers available to work in the manufacturing industrial sector is inevitably declining. And Japan, unfortunately, is famous for very much limiting immigration into the country. So that's not, at least now, a politically viable option, maybe in the future. So in that sense, it's actually quite likely that there will be, in the near future, areas that will be depopulated to an extent where industrial capabilities are going to be either replaced by immigrant workers or automated, which is happening at a rapid clip, roboticization, the use of artificial intelligence, and the like. But in the worst case scenario, will perhaps be left behind in especially in the more rural areas, not necessarily in the core urban centers.
I'd like a very brief comment. it's not exactly the correct word for the left behind industry, but my experience tells me that it's related to the situation of domestic demand. In Japan, for example, the oil industry faces a long-term trend of declining domestic demand. So under the circumstance, every company in the oil industry work very hard to reduce costs, but it's not enough. So finally, I think that kind of industrial consolidation happened. When I joined the institute, there are more than 15 oil companies in Japan, but now only 3 major groups. And these companies are making very strong work to rationalize the operation, but also they need to diversify their business. Still, the oil industry, oil business is the main part, but they are working for power business and gas business and the new innovative business such as hydrogen and etc. So I think that this will be the key.
Other questions?
Thank you. One of the policies that Japan had, I would like to ask about a feed-in tariff system that was put in place, I think in 2012, to try to get renewables online quickly after the decline of nuclear energy in Fukushima. If anyone is familiar with that, could you say a little bit about how it worked and is it still going on? It was a system that allowed people to put in solar panels on their roofs and get a 20-year good rate of power being bought.
Okay. Yes, it is true that feed-in tariff in Japan was introduced in 2012 under the Democratic Party of Japan government. At that time, the Prime Minister Kan was very keen to introduce that system so that the very rapid acceleration of renewable introduction, in particular solar PV. And in reality, that after that introduction, the capacity of solar PV in Japan exponentially increased, now up to almost 100 gigawatt. It's an amazing speed of increase. So in this respect, the policy is successful in terms of volumetric increase in renewable power. But the dark side of the story is, as you pointed out, to promote that acceleration, the term of FIT was too generous for the investors. The price of buying the solar power is extremely high, and 20-year guarantee to purchase. So it's a kind of investor dream. So there's a rush of investment. What happened was that the big increase is surcharge for renewable power production, and now Japanese consumer need to pay very high surcharge. And the government understands this is a kind of failure of the policy, and to scrap the feed-in tariff system into feed-in premium and a new policy. So we learned a lot. In terms of volume, it was successful, but in terms of pricing, it is a very big challenge for them.
Quick follow-up, I've also heard of cases where the sun doesn't shine and it's hot and there's no wind and there are power crunches. And is that also related to the success of the feed-in tariff system?
Of course, for this renewable introduction, the natural condition matters a lot. Sunshine and clouds and the stable wind is very important. And I should say that in Japan, that renewable resources is not as good as, for example, in Texas or in case of wind power in Northern European countries. But we are working very hard to promote renewable. Actually, as I pointed out, our strategic energy plan has a target to increase the double share of renewable power in the year 2030. And this year we will start the next round of strategic energy plan. And the Ministry of Economic and Trade and Industry will start a serious discussion for the target of 2035 in line with the COP28 lower step rate target. So I think that the share of renewable should be much higher, and also we need to maintain or increase the share of nuclear power. So it's a big political challenge for us.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think the greater constraint in Japan on renewables adoption is less about things like is the sun shining and, is the physical space available, it's politics. And geothermal is a good example of this, right? There's pushback from operators of hot springs that basically they're concerned that the development of geothermal energy will lead to their water running dry or becoming cold. And if you own a capital asset, which is a hotel on top of a hot spring, this is essentially an existential question. And so even though the science suggests that it's really not going to cause those types of problems, the government has oftentimes faced opposition. And you've seen similar, essentially NIMBY type of opposition against solar and wind development. And I think this is an ongoing challenge. How do you combat or compensate for those kinds of concerns that the ordinary Japanese citizens have about this rapid transition to renewable energy?
That said, the transition back to nuclear is gaining traction now. That it's not nearly as politically taboo as it, of course, was right after the Fukushima incident and maybe about a decade following. So it's really taken about 10 plus years for the public to come around and realize that perhaps at least some use of nuclear is necessary and viable option for Japan at this point.
Thank you so much. My question was, I know in all of the prepared remarks at the beginning, you talked a lot about innovation, and innovation is sort of the energy required to do heavy manufacturing or heavy industry. And I was wondering, we talk a lot about innovation. What if innovation takes longer than we'd like it to? It always seems to be sort of always on the horizon, innovation is always coming. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe perhaps policy prescriptions to help spur innovation or to help remove roadblocks to innovation or to ramping up innovative energy production abilities on the local level in both Japan and even in the U.S. If you have an answer to those.
I think it's a great question. And one of the answers is included in the key component of the GX green transformation policy conducted in Japan now. As you may know that CO2-free hydrogen is regarded super clean, which is good for environment, but the problem is too costly. And now that in GX there is a component of so-called CND, or the mechanism to fill the gap between the cost of innovative fuel and competing traditional fuels such as oil. So there is a mechanism to fill the gap. So if this policy can be very successful, that clean fuel such as CO2-free hydrogen can be introduced in a substantial manner in Japan, that will be very important. For example, I can recall that the last year the International Energy Agency, IEEJ, published a very interesting report. If we compare the supply side of clean hydrogen and demand side of hydrogen, we have plenty of supply, but there is a very limited commitment from user or buyer to buy the clean hydrogen. So if the Japan's GX policy can be very successful, it can create, it can pave the way to promote the global supply chain of clean fuel. I had a very interesting meeting with Mr. Podesta of the United States last week in Tokyo, and I had a discussion of how we Japan and the United States can collaborate. U.S. IRA, Japan GX. One of the important arguments that I made is development of clean hydrogen, ammonia, EVs, and supply chain between the United States and Japan. IRA and GX can be a potential solution.
All right, well, in the order of staying on time, I want to once again give a hand to our panelists for all of their insight. Thank you so much for being here. We still have some time in this space, so we can still keep the party going. You can ask questions after this. I hope you enjoyed. Please fill out the surveys before you leave. Have some more snacks, and I hope that you'll take the time, if you like this program, to check out more of what the World Affairs Council and the Japan America Society are doing. I'm hoping to hear some good discussions, and thank you very much.